A single post, consisting of a mere 3 words, was all it took to cause the most powerful political bloc on the planet to begin shaking at its very foundations. When Elon Musk, the individual who owns the internet's digital town square, controls the vast web of satellites circling the globe, and occupies a seat at the right hand of the most powerful government on Earth, publicly issued a call for the total abolition of the European Union, the global community did not simply laugh it off as a joke. It listened with rapt attention, because this was not some random, impulsive provocation from a bored billionaire on a Sunday afternoon. Rather, it was a calculated, precision strike aimed directly at the heart of a 27-nation alliance that has spent the better part of the last decade trying to cage and regulate the very technology upon which Musk has built his vast empire. And for perhaps the first time in the history of the European Union, the people it governs are not entirely certain whose side they are actually on. This is not just a story about one man versus one institution, but a broader saga about whether the political order that has governed 500 million people since the ruins of World War II can truly survive the onset of the age of digital power. It is a story about money, control, free speech, and the quiet, simmering fury of nations that sign treaties they are no longer entirely sure they believe in, and it is happening right now. To grasp why Musk's words landed with the impact of a grenade in the halls of Brussels, you first need to understand exactly what the European Union has become and why a growing number of people across the continent have begun to quietly agree with his radical assessment. The European Union was born out of total devastation following 2 world wars that tore the continent apart and left its cities in ruins. In the aftermath, European leaders made a solemn promise that such horrors would never happen again, building institutions designed to bind nations together through the ties of trade, law, and shared governance. The underlying idea was elegant in its simplicity. If countries were made economically dependent on each other, they would have no logical reason to go to war, and if they shared a single legal framework, disputes would be resolved at negotiating tables rather than on bloody battlefields. For decades, it appeared that this framework worked perfectly. Europe enjoyed its longest uninterrupted period of peace in recorded history while economies grew, borders opened, and a new generation of Europeans grew up thinking in terms of an entire continent rather than just a single country. But something fundamental began to change in the early years of the 21st century. The EU expanded rapidly from its original 6 founding nations to a massive bloc of 27 member states stretching from Portugal in the west to Romania in the east. With each new expansion came new layers of complexity, new contradictions, and new tensions. The institutions in Brussels grew larger, slower, and more bureaucratic as rules multiplied and regulations thickened. The distance between the people of Europe and the officials making decisions on their behalf grew wider with every passing year, leading citizens to feel that Brussels was no longer governing with them, but was instead governing over them. The 2008 financial crisis exposed a deep fault line in the European project that has never fully healed. When the global economy collapsed, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund imposed brutal, uncompromising austerity measures on countries like Greece, Portugal, and Spain. Unemployment in Greece eventually surpassed 27%, and youth unemployment in Spain climbed above 50%, leaving entire generations to watch their futures evaporate while technocrats in Brussels and Frankfurt debated debt ratios and structural reforms. The political resentment born in those desperate years never truly disappeared, it simply went underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface. That moment arrived in 2016 when British voters chose to leave the European Union in a referendum that sent shockwaves around the world. Brexit was not simply a vote about trade agreements or immigration policy, but a loud, defiant signal that a significant portion of Europe's population had grown deeply uncomfortable with the direction the EU was heading. While Brussels insisted that Brexit was an isolated event driven by British exceptionalism, the populist movements rising simultaneously in Hungary, Poland, Italy, France, and the Netherlands suggested otherwise, indicating that something deeper was stirring across the continent. Into this fractured landscape walked Elon Musk, not in the role of a politician or a diplomat, but as the owner of the world's most influential social media platform and the operator of a satellite internet network that no government on Earth had been able to fully replicate. His acquisition of Twitter, which he rebranded as X in 2022, was far more than a simple business transaction, it was a declaration of intent. Musk believes that the world's digital public square had been captured by ideological gatekeepers who decided what millions of people were allowed to see, say, and think. He moved quickly to dismantle content moderation teams, reinstated banned accounts, and released internal documents showing how governments had quietly pressured platforms to suppress speech, positioning himself as the last line of defense between ordinary citizens and the invisible architecture of digital censorship. In Europe, this was received very differently depending on who you were. For millions of ordinary users who felt their views had been silenced online, Musk became a symbol of liberation, but for EU officials and the European Commission, he became a direct threat to the regulatory order they had spent years constructing. The EU's Digital Services Act, one of the most sweeping pieces of digital regulation ever written, required large platforms to actively moderate harmful content or face fines of up to 6% of their global revenue. To Brussels, this was responsible governance, but to Musk, it was institutionalized censorship dressed in legal language. The confrontation escalated through 2024 and into 2025 as European regulators launched formal investigations into X, to which Musk responded not with lawyers and lobbying, but with something far more disruptive. He took the argument directly to the public through X, broadcasting his case to hundreds of millions of users across Europe and framing each regulatory action as evidence of a Brussels machine that feared free speech because free speech threatened its power. He amplified the voices of European populist leaders and mocked EU commissioners by name, calling the Digital Services Act a censorship law written by people who had never faced an election in their lives. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and shocking, he went further by questioning the EU's right to exist at all. In a series of posts that spread across X with extraordinary speed, Musk argued that the European Union had become an unelected supranational government imposing its will on sovereign nations and their citizens, calling it a failed experiment in bureaucratic overreach. He said Europe would be stronger, freer, and more democratic without it, stating in terms that left no room for misinterpretation that the EU should be abolished. The reaction from Brussels was swift and furious, with officials condemning his statements as dangerous, irresponsible, and a deliberate attempt to destabilize European democracy. Several EU leaders called for emergency discussions on how to respond to the growing influence of foreign technology billionaires on European political discourse, with one senior official describing Musk's posts as the most direct external attack on EU institutional legitimacy since the bloc's founding. The language in Brussels was the language of crisis, but what Brussels did not say publicly was that behind closed doors, officials were frightened. The polling data coming in from across the continent was telling them something they had not expected. A significant number of European citizens were not condemning Musk, but were instead nodding along. This raised a haunting question for every parliament and commission building in Europe. If the man calling for the EU's abolition has more followers, more reach, and possibly more trust than the institution itself, what exactly does that institution have left to defend itself with? Brussels has never been known for moving fast, as it usually operates on the slow rhythm of committee meetings and legal consultations, but what is now being discussed inside the Commission's headquarters is anything but deliberate. It is desperate, and desperation in the hands of a bureaucratic superpower can produce something far more dangerous than anger. It can produce overreach. The option that has sent shockwaves through Europe's tech and political communities is the possibility of an outright ban, not a fine or an investigation, but a full suspension of X and potentially Starlink's commercial operations within European Union territory. The legal mechanism being explored is rooted in the Digital Services Act itself, which gives the European Commission emergency powers to temporarily restrict access to platforms deemed to pose a systemic risk to public order or democratic processes. Officials are now quietly debating whether Musk's public campaign against EU institutions meets that threshold and whether it constitutes an active threat to the stability of European democracy itself. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, one must consider what such a ban would actually mean. X currently has an estimated 100 million active users across Europe, serving as the platform where journalists break news, where politicians communicate with voters, and where millions consume information. Shutting it down would be a seismic digital disruption with immediate political consequences, as the EU would appear to be doing exactly what Musk has accused it of doing, censoring voices it does not like. The Starlink dimension adds another layer of complexity, as Starlink is critical infrastructure across rural Europe, providing the only reliable high-speed internet to hospitals, agricultural operations, and emergency services. A ban on Starlink would not just anger Musk, it would cut essential services to hundreds of thousands of European citizens who have no alternative, all in the name of protecting them from the man whose satellite is keeping their lights on. Beyond the practical consequences, there is a legal minefield involving fundamental rights law, as banning a communications platform on the grounds that its owner expressed political opinions pushes deep into the territory of the European Convention on Human Rights. Any ban would almost certainly be challenged immediately in court, and the legal battle could drag on for years while making the EU look authoritarian rather than democratic. Musk's legal team would not need to win the case immediately, they would only need to make the EU look like the villain long enough for the political damage to become irreversible. And yet, the pressure to act is building from within member states like France, Germany, and the Nordic countries, who argue that allowing a foreign billionaire to openly campaign for the dissolution of their collective political project is not a free speech issue but a governance crisis. They believe the Digital Services Act was designed precisely for moments like this and that failing to use it now would render the entire regulatory framework meaningless. What makes the internal debate even more combustible is that the 27 member states are not united, with Hungary making no secret of its sympathy for Musk and Italy's government occupying a more complex, ideological overlap with his skeptical views. The bloc that is supposed to be presenting a unified front is in reality fractured along exactly the fault lines that Musk has been pressing on for months. Meanwhile, Musk is not waiting passively for Brussels to make its move, as X has been building legal and operational infrastructure designed to make a European ban as costly and complicated as possible. On X itself, the narrative war continues at full intensity, framing the EU's actions as the behavior of a regime afraid of its own citizens. The stakes of this regulatory standoff extend far beyond Europe's borders, as governments around the world are watching to see whether the EU can actually enforce its regulations against the most powerful private technology operator on the planet. If Brussels blinks and retreats, it will send a signal that European regulation is ultimately a paper tiger, but if it moves forward with a ban and the consequences spiral out of control, it will demonstrate that democratic institutions are capable of responses that undermine the very values they claim to defend. The European Union is now caught between two versions of failure, and the clock in Brussels is ticking louder than it has in a very long time. The most dangerous threat to the European Union has never been Elon Musk, X, or Starlink. It is the growing number of ordinary Europeans who are beginning to ask whether leaving is the right answer. Polling data tells a story that EU officials are struggling to process, as Eurosceptic parties are polling at record highs in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria. In Italy, support for membership has dropped to its lowest level in 3 decades, and in Germany, a recent survey found that nearly 1 in 3 citizens believes the country would be better off outside the bloc. These are not fringe numbers or protest votes, but structural shifts in public opinion fueled by the spectacle of an American billionaire saying out loud what millions of Europeans have been thinking in private. Musk did not create this crisis, he simply handed it a megaphone. The disillusionment was already there in the austerity scars of the South and the sovereignty disputes of the East. What Musk has done is collapse the psychological barrier between thinking these things and saying them publicly at scale. The European Union now faces a legitimacy crisis it was never architecturally designed to survive, a crisis occurring in real time, amplified by technology it cannot control, and driven by sentiment it cannot simply legislate away. It can find platforms and threaten bans, but it cannot pass a law that makes people believe in it again. The coming months will determine whether the EU responds with genuine reform or whether it doubles down on regulatory force and accelerates its own unraveling. History is watching, and for the first time in decades, so is everyone else.